Evening. Welcome to the Wednesday, January 8th meeting of the Moscow Planning and Zoning Commission. And I'd like to begin first by introducing our new City Council liaison, who I think most of you know, Sandra Kelly. Thank you, Sandra. And then the next item is approval of the minutes from December 11th, 2019. I guess it was a while ago that we last met, but
I move their approval.
is there a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Abstentions? No abstentions? Thank you. Okay. Item 2 is election of officers. We need to elect a chair, first nominate, and then elect a chair, a vice chair, and a second vice chair for 2020. So we can open
Wendy,
up.
could I jump in here?
Yes. Yes, go ahead. Hello?
Go ahead, Rob.
We lost him.
Lost him or you hit the mute?
You must have jumped too far.
Well, I think we need to establish
What if he hit the
connection.
mute by accident?
Can you hear us, Rob?
I don't know. Maybe he started coughing.
Put it on mute.
So maybe he hit the mute button.
Yeah, probably so.
I'm back.
Oh, good. We missed you. Okay.
So I was just starting to say before you hung up on me that, no, just teasing. I would really like, Wendy, if you're willing, I would really like to see you do the chair. I like the continuity. I like what you're doing. And I just wanted to throw that in before we get to nominations.
Well, thank you for that support. I don't want to become an oligarch, but thank you. I mean, yes, I would, welcome the opportunity, but I also don't want to hog
I will
the bench.
nominate Wendy.
So I'll second that.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay,
So I'd like to
Okay.
just, keeping that continuity, I'd like to nominate Rob for vice chair.
is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay,
I'll
Rob,
abstain.
you're in.
There you go, Rob. You
Okay.
you can go have a drink now.
Okay, now we have and you're going to have to lead the meetings while I'm in California. I'll be calling in, but it's easier if there's a person in the room leading it rather than a virtual phone person who might get disconnected. So anyway, and is there? We also need to nominate and elect a second vice chair.
That's Joel, right?
Joel?
It has not been a onerous duty.
I think you
I
had to take care.
nominate Joel for second vice chair.
Yeah, I second.
I'm willing to.
Is there, okay, and Scott
I
second.
nominated
Oh, and
Victoria
Victoria second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so,
Hey, boy, we do better than Congress, that's for sure.
yeah, we're decisive bunch here. Okay, well, thank you all. I appreciate the support and the team that works with us, and particularly Mike is keeping us all on the
There
path
was
to the
actually, I
right.
think, one time when I might have been able to
You did.
serve as second vice chair.
You did.
However, I think I was out of town too, or some such thing.
Yeah, so what happens then?
Well,
Then we don't have a quorum, probably. So, okay, or we lead by phone. Yeah, it's probably possible.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on to item 3, public comment. There is currently no one in the audience tonight, but this is an opportunity for members of the public to speak before the commission regarding matters that are not on our agenda or currently pending before planning and zoning. And so anybody who might be listening, that's an opportunity for you to come in and talk to us. Okay, item 4, approval of the reasoned statement of relevant criteria and standards, and Mike will probably give us a presentation, or no, you just want us to,
Yeah, this was just for the
Yeah.
Latah Federal Credit Union rezone that we heard in our December meeting, rezoning from residential office to general business, and the commission recommended approval of that to council, and it's just the standard relevant criteria and standards document that we approve for these matters.
Move to accept.
is there a second?
It looks longer than the original deal.
It has some legalese in it?
Wow, you know.
It looked good to me.
Yeah, it looked good to me.
Yeah. Okay, this may be a records fast meeting. And you're moving to approve, is there a second? Scott
Second, yeah.
seconds, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Opposed, okay,
Oh, aye.
motion carries. All right, so item 5 is a discussion about small cell wireless facilities and their possible impact and how they might impact our decision-making, and Mike Ray is going to give a presentation. So,
Yeah, so I'm sure you're all aware of the, over the last few years, just the recent rollout of 5G small cell technology throughout the world in the U.S. And this is really just, really we don't address them in our zoning code right now. We have telecommunications facilities, but really they're geared towards the 60, 80-foot towers that largely implement 4G technology. And we have a number of those in town. There's a handful of them, 3 or 4, that we typically have larger towers than some other jurisdictions, and we require carriers to co-locate on those towers so we don't have as many of them throughout town. But it's a little bit different with the 5G network. And there was an email that I received today from Nancy Cheney, and I just forwarded that on to everybody on the commission. And there has been a little bit of, recently in the news over the last 10 years, just controversy over radio waves that 5G generates and whether those are harmful or not to humans. So a little bit of background, we have cellular communication systems designed to transport voice communications. They were easily handled with those larger towers. And then we ended up, as technology evolving, wireless data demand has grown. So it just used to be voice, and now all of a sudden we have this large demand on data that everybody has on smartphones. And so those legacy towers are being overwhelmed with wireless data traffic. And so you can kind of see this diagram. The voice tower is good for voice. Data signal can degrade over distance. So it's really good on voice, a little bit less on data. But then you have the small cell network, it's good for voice and data. There's a lot more frequency, so small cell networks are typically smaller, and they're usually one with every 500 feet. And so it just really increases the amount of data that you can generate in those.
So do you want to start out by telling an old man why they call it small cell?
I think it's mainly just because of the scale of it. So typically you have these really large antenna towers that are 60.
So it's not about the frequency, it's about the littler towers.
it looks like in that diagram it's about street light height?
Yeah,
Is that
it's
what I'm
typically,
seeing?
yep, it's typically
Yeah.
15 feet tall.
More like a distribution
Yeah.
system, you have a large, now this is bringing it down.
Yeah.
Well, isn't it, okay.
So
go ahead.
every 500 feet, you said? So that would be about
Typically,
one per block?
that's
about?
typically what they need is,
Yeah.
every 500 feet, there is some type of small cell
Which
tower.
means, I suspect, that these waves can be more easily stopped by
Yeah, they're
walls and
they're
stuff.
higher, they're higher.
So if I'm
yeah.
in my basement, I'm probably not gonna get it very well, or if you're in a parking structures usually would wipe out even current
Yeah.
cells.
So I think they're higher frequency radio waves. And so, they're more susceptible of being stopped, and that's why you have to have the network that is much smaller and closer aligned.
Is it affected by density so that where you have tons of apartments, you have more users. Does that affect how many you need in that area, or does that not matter?
I'm not necessarily sure. I don't know.
If you're talking every 500 feet, to me that implies a small tower, a small device every 3 or 4 blocks.
Yep, well, every block.
Yeah.
Yes,
Well,
we were talking about big blocks.
Well, yeah, but
last
when you
meeting.
count the streets, you know,
Yeah.
there's the block and then there's the street
Yeah,
width, so
right.
then you're
So-
getting to 500 feet pretty
You
fast, yeah.
sort of visualize it as in the middle of
Mike,
4 blocks.
we went over these tower, what, about a year and a half ago, maybe?
Not that long.
We were looking at,
Right.
you know, the different tower styles for this small.
Some of them can be co-located on
Yeah.
utility
Right.
poles and.
Yeah, and I've got that in this presentation
Oh, yeah,
as well.
yeah.
So,
Oh, gotcha, sorry,
yeah.
we should just let you go.
Oh, no.
Mike,
Yeah.
could I ask a quick question while you're in the middle of this, and you may get to it later, but in neighborhoods where we've gone to underground utilities rather than above ground where they could utilize or co-utilize light posts and also just regular telephone poles, utility lines, is there going to be an issue with putting towers up to service those neighborhoods?
Well, a lot of times if there's no telephone pole or light pole in that area, they're almost always going to have light poles in a residential neighborhood, so that would be an opportunity. But there are some examples of like just a regular freestanding pole that's just completely dedicated to small cell, and I've got some pictures in this presentation as well.
Okay, great, thanks.
About that, yeah. So the 5G is much higher data speed and traffic. Looking at increasing the need, providers are deploying small cell installations to accommodate the demand in data. So these are the examples of what we have currently with our typical towers in town. And this is in East Side Marketplace, just to the east of that. And then we've got a tower, I believe this is looking onto Baker Street down here. We're up on, I think, between C and A Street there by the church. And the community garden is around this area as well.
I wondered what that was.
You also have some structure-mounted antennas, so Theophilus Tower, McConnell Building, and then we've got quite a few of antennas on our water tanks in town. So that's a pretty common facility in order to locate the antennas on. So this kind of gives you the example of a diagram of typically what happens. You typically have your call, which ends up, being conveyed to the larger hard cell or macro cell tower, ends up going fiber optically to a switching station, and then ends up going to the recipient and through another macro cell tower. And it's typically the tower that's located in the closest proximity to the person that you're calling. The way small cell works with data, essentially take that data to the small cell pole, end up going the same route to the switching office, and ending up through the small cell pole in the area where the person is.
Mike, could you try to speak up a little bit?
Sure. So this is just a diagram of the typical components of a small cell network. So you have these nodes that are typically located up at the top. There's small radio frequency transmitters that send and receive radio signals to and from the mobile device. You've got the high-speed connection, the connection from the node to the base station. It's usually fiber optic. Then you have some amount of ground equipment. So radio transceivers send and process the wireless signals, usually located in the way of central location. And then you've got the fiber optic cable that's in the ground. So you have a number of kind of just the existing installation. So there's an existing telephone pole. There's a proposed Verizon pole-mounted equipment, and then there's the device on the top. So this would be the node coming out of the top of the device that's installed, and then you've got the equipment there. So this would be the kind of the ground equipment, and then it leads into the fiber optic cable into the ground. There's some other examples of just light poles that have the nodes installed on the top, and then a lot of the equipment is more contained stealthily within the pole itself. Another node coming up off a light pole, and then this would be the equipment box here on the side. These are the small cell nodes, like in residential areas that may not have the frequency of lighting that light poles that you need. This is just solely a freestanding equipment, a small cell node and equipment and freestanding pole for that need. So really, we have aesthetic concerns with these. So there are a number of antennas that could be placed on light poles and telephone poles, and you could end up, if the community doesn't have regulations in place to address the aesthetic concerns, you could end up with situations like this where you have multiple equipment boxes and antenna that are installed and just really not a pretty sight and just producing visual clutter.
Are we going to face multiple sets of these for the various carriers?
Yeah, it's every carrier, generally, the way it works now is that we have these telecommunications towers, and they usually co-locate the individual carriers' antennas on the towers. Depending upon the size of the tower, kind of determines how many carriers are able to locate their antenna on these towers. And so I would imagine that there'd be multiple providers on a single small cell tower. But I
guess
think
I was wondering that's why some of these look so ugly.
I think that's exactly the reason, is that you probably have multiple carriers, for the small cell network on these poles, and that's the reason there's so many of them.
Yeah.
Sure. What's the implication to people who use cable? Will the cable companies likely provide 5G as well? Do you think?
Like cable TV?
Yeah, well, I mean, in our particular case, we bundle everything on our cable.
Yeah.
So I've got my wireless, my router is on it, I've got the regular telephone, and I've got the TV all on the thing. Now, I'm just making a presumption that if you needed 5G, if there was some reason that cable would continue to add that to their lexicon of stuff, I don't know.
Probably with the increase in data speeds that...
You'll have a cell phone, right?
I do.
And your cell phone is talking to a cell. Your Wi-Fi and so on may be talking to your cable.
Well, and so I just don't understand exactly what the 5G thing is, because when I get home, I can be on, I can be hooked up to the internet.
Yeah.
In my case, because I'm with Sprint, the minute I go out of town, I'm no longer connected to the internet.
Because that's the Wi-Fi connection, right? And then if you have a cellular connection, like, you can be in the middle of nowhere, well, somewhere that you can use your cell phone and also pick up data, that's going through the cellular system. So I think they're different tracks, but I'm not an expert on it.
Well, I don't I'm just asking because I don't quite get it. Do you
They're
know
different,
that,
but I
Scott?
think the data speed of 5G network you may start to see some of those consolidating. And
You
moving
might
just
not be able to get the speed without a fiber feed
Yeah.
versus, the old copper line probably isn't gonna give you 5G, it won't support it,
Yeah.
so.
So I guess what would be nice to know that all of this seems to be asking is, how much press will there be on the individual pole that gets located every 500 feet, or will there have to be two of them? I think that's maybe what the concern might be, yeah. And we probably can't answer it without
And
somebody
also,
from a
the
cable company
hardware
telling us.
requires
Or-
power, so if we have 3 or 4 carriers,
Yeah.
are we gonna have 3 or 4 meters as well? That could be a substantial,
Well, I guess my confusion is that we're saying that the normal cell towers handles plenty of talking, but the 5G is more information, more not just telephone calls, but I take it watching things and information.
Well, the data you would use on your phone, I don't know if it would include the data you use on your computer that's part of a Wi-Fi internet
It would
system.
mainly be the data from
Yeah.
your cellular phone.
Yeah,
But in the range, if it was within 5G small cell tower range, your voice would go through there as well.
Yeah.
It's just that it would, I mean, if you saw that diagram before, the data speed would be really 5 stars and the voice is 5 stars as well. You just have to be within range of a 5G network.
Somebody has said to me that, and again, I don't really understand this stuff, and I'm gonna die before it's important, I suppose, unless it's just important next week. But 4G gets around better than 5G, right? In other words, 4G can come from a big.
It's got a longer
and
range.
go a long
Yeah, it's
way,
got a longer
and I don't
range.
think that's gonna go away anytime soon, so it looks like we'll have both, huh?
Yeah, yeah.
Mike, is there anybody close to here that has started the small cell facilities, or, is Spokane, Coeur d'Alene,
Yeah,
is anybody?
yeah. I think Lewiston. I think there's a company that specifically targets more of rural communities. Extenet, I believe, is the name, and so they'll go and do just with the larger scale cell towers. You have companies that pretty much construct the towers and then will lease out the space for the cellular companies to locate their antennas on. So that seems to be the model that this company uses. And I believe that, Lewiston has recently adopted some 5G regulations, and I think that they are starting to install them in Lewiston, I believe, with that company. But we have, there's been a company that's been in contact with us about, a franchise agreement in order to bring small cell into Moscow.
Mike, 2 things. Scott was mentioning power. Is that what the green stuff is there? Is that part at the bottom of this right-hand pole? That's additional clutter. We usually see the pictures of the top of the poles.
Okay.
I'm seeing, since you mentioned that, it made me look, seeing all this clutter down here at the bottom too. Is this part of the thing that we have to deal with?
Well, there's usually equipment boxes, and I don't know if that's necessarily associated with the cell or not, but it appears to be a lot larger than the typical,
Yeah,
equipment that you
'Cause
would
I've
see
seen
on the,
usually they're in a box
So I would
and-
assume so, but usually the fiber optic, you have the equipment box, it may be stealth, within the pole so you can't see it, and then it runs into fiber optic within the ground. And then runs, so you typically have no equipment boxes sitting on the ground like that, but that may be one of the early installations, and
Well, you have
with a
a
number
lot of
of
things
number
on-
of cellular providers, maybe there just wasn't enough space on the pole itself, maybe it couldn't handle the weight of it, and so they ended up locating on the ground,
Jeez.
is why,
Yeah, okay. And then, can you go back a couple of slides?
It looks like they made some effort to paint it green to blend in with the shrubs behind it. That's what it looks like. Want me to go back? Is that
Yeah.
what you-
To where you had that. So we have a lot, if we wind up putting these on light structures, and we have a lot of historic lights.
Mhm.
I mean, it's one thing to put them on the one on the left, the big street lights.
Mhm.
It's another thing to have your historic lights. And so something we want to keep in mind is we don't want to mess up our historic lighting system.
Yeah, I think the Preservation Commission probably will want to weigh in on the two historic
Sure,
districts in
and
particular.
yeah.
Yeah.
And, certainly, if they're located in a historic district, we have every right to require different design standards for those, depending upon where they're located in the city. I know that some in historic districts have, more higher quality design.
The Jackson parking lot, all the parking lots back there have this lighting.
Sure.
I would think downtown, they would probably lease space from, buildings.
Build and put them on
versus-
rooftops.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that would probably be better because it also puts it, well, if it ends up having to be an independent structure, it also puts more obstacles in the sidewalk for pedestrianism
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
stuff.
it's another thing.
Probably depends on how low the building is, but we have
Yeah.
quite a few,
Right.
1, 2-story buildings that
Right.
are downtown that I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be able to use those. So we're largely governed by the Telecommunications Act. I believe it was 1996 is when that came into effect. So local jurisdictions have to provide telecommunications providers reasonable access within the public right-of-way, cannot effectively deny their ability to provide service. So those larger cell towers typically couldn't be located in the right-of-way, so we really didn't have a real issue previously, and we had a little bit greater control to regulate them on private property. We're prohibited from regulating wireless communication facilities based on radio frequency emissions and effectively prohibiting delivering telecommunications service. So, that's what the letter we received from
Right.
Nancy, and it's really been controversial as to whether they do have an effect or do not. There's been several cities throughout the U.S. that have filed a lawsuit against the FCC, effectively trying to challenge that regulation that they can't, really regulate based upon radio frequency emissions. So they just issued a new ruling, and that was at the end of September. It's intended to streamline the permitting of 5G, so it's really just to, streamline the rollout of this technology. They have maximum fees that can be charged for small cell applications and right-of-way use. So if you go above that, I think you're just subject to being sued. I don't know that there's any fines for that. It's just, you're opening yourself up to more of a lawsuit. They have this shot clock, is what they call it, which is a decision time frame for small cell applications. So if somebody were to submit, a provider to submit an application, we have 60 days for a co-location upon an existing utility pole. And then if it's just a standalone tower, we have 90 days to essentially process that application. And then if there's a new appeal process for shot clock violations. So looking at kind of local government recommendations that they've made, it's pretty much telling us that they're likely coming and communities will not be able to exclude them. It's recommended that the communities stay within the safe harbor fee maximums or clearly document the basis for their fees. Recommending communities establish clear aesthetic standards related to the number of attachments, so avoiding the clutter, shielding, equipment, antennas, and cabling. And then the location and spacing requirements to avoid clutter or over-concentration of antennas. And then develop kind of our process for permitting to comply with the shot clock requirement and the time limits. So this is kind of an example of, I think this is taken from another jurisdiction about acceptable places in order to install small cell on an existing telephone tower. So you've got the utility pole, equipment shroud up here, down here, energy meter with disconnect, and then it goes into the electrical and small cell fiber in the ground.
So to relate to Rob's question, when when everything's underground utilities, what happens then? I mean, in this diagram, it doesn't really,
Well, yeah, it would just be the standalone pole that they
okay.
would construct that looks similar to a light pole or a telephone pole, and
Okay.
that would become
Okay.
essentially the small cell. So this would be a co-location, is what we would call this. So right now, underneath our code, telecommunications code, we allow co-location. So if we don't have any design standards for these. If somebody were to apply today for a small cell co-location on some telephone poles or light poles within the city, it would be allowed by right within our code. We wouldn't be able to deny them. And that's why it's, I think prudent to establish some standards for small cell.
Right.
But this is what we call a co-location because there's already a pole that they're installing antennas on.
Okay.
If it were just a new, a standalone new pole specifically for small cell,
we'd have some.
that would be
control
that would be a new tower, and we typically require a conditional use permit for those, even though our code right now really contemplates ones that are 60 feet in the air. So this is another example of a street light. So you've got the luminaire there. We've got the antenna on the very top, so it'd be extended up. You've got the equipment in a couple locations, and then it goes into the ground for the electrical conduit and the small cell fiber network.
Wouldn't you
No.
think that there's streetlights, even though Rob lives in a wonderful area? They
Right.
still have streetlights.
Right, sure,
You would
yep.
think that the streetlights are every couple of blocks or whatever, that would probably be an opportunity. I haven't looked.
Yeah, it's an
out there.
opportunity.
I haven't driven Conestoga in the daylight recently. I better do that.
Well, usually there's a street light at every intersection. It's typically the way it
Right.
works. And so, it's also, I think that they would likely locate those on the street lights. And it also gives an opportunity, Vista owns the majority of the street lights in Moscow. And it gives them an opportunity to make revenue off of that by allowing cellular providers to, so they have an incentive in order to.
Is this suggesting that to get to the street light, there would have to be a fiber?
You need some fiber.
Underground fiber?
Yep. Yep.
So this is a dumb question, but what part of all of that stuff radiates RF, the issue of, radio frequency transmissions that people are worried about?
Well, I believe it, yeah. I
It's
mean,
all the way
the
from
whole
the top?
setup, but it's this is
Okay.
the antenna on the
Okay,
top.
so it would be the highest point usually?
Uh-huh,
Okay.
yeah. So
Well,
those
when we talked about this about a year ago, it was mentioned that if utility poles, which mostly you're looking at the metal streetlight poles, but if you were looking at off an alley or something with the wooden poles or something like that, one of the things we want to keep in mind is the trees. We don't want to be damaging homeowners' trees and city trees and so
Yeah.
on and so forth.
Yeah.
And that's part of the aesthetics.
Right, exactly. Vista already does a pretty good job of butchering them. And it's too bad. I wish Moscow would consolidate on a number of streets to at least one side of the street with utilities, so we aren't cutting into trees on both sides. But that's a different issue.
Well, it sounds like you've
Yeah.
had some interest, so we probably
Yeah.
need to.
Right.
Yeah, they're,
Start.
I mean, I think they're interested in entering into a franchise agreement, how fast they're looking at, actually installing some type of small cell network, not sure.
So are you hearing, just to go along with the letter that we received from the Nurses Association, I was just looking online for a minute. I didn't look very hard. But this is from the UK. And maybe, I don't know if the Europeans are a little ahead of us or not, I don't know. It said Dr. Frank DeVot, whatever, who helps advise the government on mobile phone safety, says although some of the research suggests a statistical possibility of increased cancer risk for heavy users, I guess that means people who watch movies all day long, or what? What do you mean a heavy user?
Well, if you hold your cell phone to your ear, I mean, you're much better off putting your phone
Yeah,
down
yeah,
and having it on
yeah.
speakerphone, because when
Right.
it's right next to your brain.
So
I
anyway,
mean,
it says the
there's-
evidence today for casual relation is not sufficiently convincing to suggest the need for precautionary action. But then it goes on to say, however, there is a group of scientists and doctors who have written to the EU calling for the rollout of 5G to be halted. So there apparently is issues. So you should probably keep your ear to the, and see cities like, big cities that have agencies that have tons of money and lawyers would be the ones to listen to see if, what's happening. What's happening in Seattle? Are they rolling right ahead, or has there been any bump in the road in a place like Seattle, do you know?
I don't know necessarily Seattle, but I know that there's been at least one or two communities outside the Bay Area that have, filed a lawsuit against the FCC, and I think there are a number, and I don't know if it's a kind of a class action where they're, all jump on the same lawsuit towards the FCC or not, but I think that that's, essentially what it is. But yeah, I mean, that's largely associated with the FCC's ruling in the Telecommunications Act that local communities can't regulate 5G networks or any telecommunication network based upon adverse health effects. So when you look at a decision and there's a new tower that's proposed, local communities aren't allowed to take that into consideration about any adverse health effects that tower may cause if it's located, say, within a residential neighborhood. And so that's largely what they're suing the FCC on right now. So I think, in our point of view is that we have, clearly we don't address it in our zoning code right now.
Yeah.
We want to have some requirements in place so we don't get those adverse effects of the aesthetics of all the antennas hanging off the poles. We want to develop some type of master agreement so we can generate allow the city to generate revenue off of it. But, certainly if the city council feels that they would like to enter into the lawsuit as well, I mean, that's certainly a city council decision.
But in terms of looking at what our role would be, coming up with design standards or at least recommendations, it seems like trying to ferret out other communities that have developed the design standards to see what they are would be helpful.
Yeah,
Is that
I
next
think,
step, or-
yeah.
I don't know.
Yep, and I think that our city attorney was working on that, and I think that at one point, I think Lewiston was jurisdiction that she was looking at, and I think when we reviewed that, they were actually kind of weak on the design standard aspect of it. So we've drafted, an ordinance that goes through that, and I can bring that next time and we can go through it. But yeah, I think that's the bigger issue with us is that, we already fight signs to a certain extent as
Right,
far as
right.
visual clutter on our corridors. And, this is really, usually you typically don't have signs in residential neighborhoods, whereas you could have, small cell networks in residential neighborhoods. So I think it's a really big impact as far as aesthetic concerns within the community. And I think that really that is, one thing that we should probably focus on quite a bit. So, but yeah, this is an example of something that's done rather well with a cantenna on the very top for a street pole. And then you've got all the equipment down here at the base, which is,
Covered up.
covered up, and so you don't have the box hanging off the side of it. And that's just connected to the fiber in the ground after that.
So extracting what the design guidelines would be from that diagram would be helpful.
Yep, and these are, I don't know if we got these from Boise or not, but these are kind of examples, of acceptable small cell installations.
So conceivably, you could have 5 equipment shrouds stuck on that pole if 5G network, and so,
Yeah,
that one is, seems a little problematic without some constraints on,
sure.
yeah.
And so this is just like Rob said, this is kind of the example. If there's no street light, there's no telephone pole, and they have to have a freestanding small cell, this is what it would look like, similar to the light pole, only there's no light mast coming off of it. It's just the pole and the antenna on the top, and then the equipment cabinet at the very bottom. So, as we see it, kind of our objectives to minimize the number of antennas throughout the community, encourage co-location, encourage the use of existing buildings, lighter utility poles, water towers, or other structures, so we can discourage kind of the construction of new antenna towers.
Should we say rooftops of existing buildings?
Yeah, I think
So that it's not hanging on
yeah.
the side?
yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Making sure that the visual impact on the surroundings is minimized, and that the telecommunications facilities don't have an effect of prohibiting the provision of telecommunications services, does not unreasonably discriminate among functionally equivalent providers of such services, and allows provision of adequate area coverage by such services. So that's what we currently say.
I think what Wendy brought up, the standalones not blocking walkways is an important element too.
Sure. Yeah, and all those was, would be in the furnishing zone. It would be similar to, any type of light pole or telephone pole that would be out of the clear walkway width of a sidewalk. So just briefly going over our telecommunications code. So new antenna towers, so it's conditionally permitted in all zones right now. So like I said before, if you have a light pole and you locate an antenna on that, that's a co-location, it's not a new tower. If you have a telephone pole and you have an antenna on that, it's a co-location, it's not a new tower. So we're talking, specifically just new towers.
And we can't, just to reiterate, we can't regulate even what that looks like, so that would, how do you avoid the
Right
5
now,
companies sticking onto a telephone pole problem?
yeah, right now we can't.
We can't.
In our code, we don't regulate that.
But do we have the ability
Yeah.
to change that?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
okay, I just want to
Yep.
make sure.
So this is our current code, just kind
Yeah,
of what we
gotcha.
currently have in
Okay,
place,
Okay,
which is geared towards the really large,
right.
radio
Gotcha,
towers.
yeah.
So any new tower is conditionally permitted in all zones. So if they do install a small cell and it's just a standalone tower, they would have to go through a conditional use permit process. And then we've got requirements. So once again, this is geared towards the really large towers. So if it's over 60 feet in height, it's not permitted within 500 feet of 95 or Highway 8 right-of-way, unless in the U or University, Motor Business, or Industrial Zone. But it has to be set back 100 feet from the right-of-way. So, yeah, this is geared toward those larger towers. A lot of the small cell is located in the right-of-way on the utility towers. Tower setback equal to the height of the tower. To residential uses, half the height of other uses. Not lighted unless required by the FAA. Once you get above a certain height, then the FAA requires you to put a light on it for planes. Can't be any noisier than 45 decibels at the property line. It has to be a neutral color with matching color cables and antennas. And then the ground equipment has to be in a masonry wall in all residential districts. Can be a slatted fence, landscape, or other districts. 1 parking stall for maintenance. And the above ground ancillary facilities located 25 to 50 feet from residential property boundaries. And then you have to provide notice to all other communications providers during the application process so they can commit to co-locating. So right now it's, we don't address small cell, and it's really just geared toward those larger towers. So that's really the gap we have. And then our co-locations, if we were to place a small cell antenna on top of a utility pole, It's just allowed by right. That's our definition, is placement of an antenna upon existing support structure. And existing support structure is any structure or building not constructed primarily for the purpose of supporting an antenna. So it's really just any structure is how we currently define that. It's allowed by right in all zones, so long as it doesn't project 18 feet above or 8 feet away. And if it does, then we require a conditional use permit. So based upon these small cells, it's never going to meet that threshold, and it'll just be allowed by right currently. So looking at our small cell objectives: to provide reasonable access, to provide desired services, minimize visual clutter, ensure installations are aesthetically pleasing, they don't obstruct sidewalks, roadways, do not interfere with light fixture function, and then we've got this creation of a permitting system that can facilitate processing of applications within that shot clock time frame, and then coordinating with utility and streetlight owners. So we had the next steps of looking at coordination between relevant departments and utility pole owners, which we need to do. Program outline of the general parameters necessary to address right-of-way use conflicts and access standards in compliance with federal requirements. And then zoning updates, aesthetic installation standards, and right-of-way permitting process, which we've worked on. And then commission review and hearing process, and that's how we see it. And certainly, all the discussion about the health concerns, how that's interwoven in this discussion as well. I know the Sustainable Environment Commission is looking at this as well, and so really it's a larger scale policy decision at the city council level, but the commission certainly can make policy recommendations to the council if they would like to as well. So at this point, I think our goal is to move forward with starting to look at the ordinance to implement a lot of the use conflicts and keeping it out of the sidewalks and making sure it's aesthetically pleasing. And then at the higher level with the, council, it's certainly, whatever, they choose to do, so.
So, going back to trees are not just aesthetics, it's part of the green infrastructure. And we have a lot of stress on getting trees, the urban forestry system in town. So I think if we need to look at trees, not just in terms of aesthetics, which is typical, but in terms of a functioning system, an urban green infrastructure would help bolster that. So that, because somebody can say, well, we don't care if you cut a limb off, who cares? I don't care if it's pretty or not, but it's part of the living infrastructure to the town. Heating, cooling, the whole bit that goes with the trees. And I'd like to see that bolstered in any way possible.
Okay.
And certainly the tree commission will be on board with it.
Right. Well, just thinking about what regulates the tall towers, it seems like we need to scale that down to this application and think about the reach of any kind of saddlebagging on the pole that, and keeping it inside.
I think we certainly
Yeah.
leave our current regulations in place for the larger
Oh, yeah, no,
towers,
I'm talking about,
but-
but develop
Yeah.
sort of a mirror, but scaled down
Sure.
for the, 15-foot pole or whatever, and how far out is stuff allowed to stick and things like that.
Sure.
And I don't know if it's appropriate for us, which commission would be looking at that if it wasn't us?
I'd be us. It's found.
Yeah, you think so?
It's in
Okay.
the zoning code, so.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, we can, like with everything, I can
Yeah,
provide examples of.
that'd be great, yeah. Because it's hard to just, it seems like we need to customize the requirements for this particular application, so.
Yeah, the not within 500 feet of US 95 makes sense for tall towers, but that probably doesn't make sense for small cells.
No.
So that kind of,
I would drive it to the neighborhoods.
yeah.
Right.
Well,
right.
and it also probably doesn't serve the area between the couplets.
Yeah.
properly.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think just looking at examples and seeing how we fine tune the whole thing, and we're just one commission weighing in, obviously, but, and anybody else have any comments, or?
Well, I think you kind of said it. I was making notes. As much as possible, if we can get the container structure like at the bottom of the pole, rather than having all these things sticking off
Right.
the pole. I'm sure it's much easier to stick them off the pole. I don't care. I want them contained at the bottom, if possible, you know.
And the stuff that is maximum radio frequency up as high as possible, because you can envision kids on bicycles going around the pole, you know, for 2 hours, and they're getting a maximum exposure. You know, we have to look at the scientific studies. We don't, you know, it's beyond our pay grade, but I think it, you know, it isn't certainly an important consideration that it.
Yeah, and, you know, I'm not convinced the metal structure is that much protection. It's aesthetic, but anywhere we can provide protection is a good idea. I mean, we could be mindful of it and shoot for the best we can get out of it.
And encouraging, you know, rooftop probably installations downtown, so that they're not further blocking the sidewalk with all the other stuff we have on the sidewalks. And so, I don't know.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Yeah, you're allowed, yes, you are, Sandra, yeah.
If it's only 500 feet, they're put up about every 500 feet. That's what I heard, correct. So are we working with the county then? Because, I mean, I'm thinking of people out Moscow Mountain area, out at Lenville Road, outside of city limits. Are we working with county liaisons to find out how to connect that up, or is it just end?
It'd probably be unlikely that they would look out in the county, you know, anytime soon, just because there's not enough of population that would make it worth it.
Okay.
It would seem.
I just, because I'm kind of with Mills, I don't understand enough of it. So if I'm making a call to somebody out in Troy, I'm still able to do that. It just doesn't go through the 5G. It still does a 4G. Is that how that works?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why I think 4G is not going anywhere.
I just wanted to make sure
As I
that
said,
I heard that
5G is
correctly.
adding a level of intensity to our digital world.
I just know from
Well-
our, like, cabin at Hebron Park, for years it was at 3G,
Yeah.
and coverage was really spotty.
Yeah.
And then when they got 4G, all of a sudden you can make, you know, calls. Yeah.
Pullman is ahead of you a little bit in this process. Lake County Planning Department just has it in the radar. They'll have to start looking at it, so they're way behind where you are. I agree with Mike that who knows what anybody's gonna do in that low density. But
Right.
their Michelle Fuzon knows that it's an issue they'll have to look at some point, but it hasn't been anything concrete at all yet.
Okay, well, next up is, so anything else, or you think that's about it for this time?
Yeah, I
And you'll
think-
come back and report to
I'll
us?
come
in
back
a-
next time.
Next time?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you, Mike. Item 6 is the Transportation Commission meeting report from Joel.
The Transportation Commission meeting is tomorrow at 4. Two main items to be discussed on the agenda. One is a request for vacation at north segment of North Howard, undeveloped segment of North Howard, and I'm not exactly sure where that is, but it's North Howard is one of these streets that sort of jumps. And,
Right.
I believe it's
and there are some undeveloped segments of it.
I think the segments between either D or F and Homestead.
Yeah, which
Does it go off a
is, I
cliff or
believe,
something? Yeah.
Drops
I was
down.
I was looking around on the Google Maps, and the the designation, the label that Google puts on what I think is probably the right-of-way is sledding hill.
Yeah.
I've never seen that on Google Maps before.
That's what it said, Sledding Hill?
It does.
That is funny.
I'm not sure whether that's being considered in, well. The second item is a grant that's being put together for corner of A and Baker for a local safety improvement program. And there have been a number of accidents, both vehicle and pedestrian there. And I think the Transportation Commission is going to be asked to support the grant proposal.
Okay.
What kind of accidents are they having there? What kind of accidents?
Pedestrian accidents. I think a couple people have been hit there just because you drop down coming off A Street, it drops down in both directions as it hits Baker. And I think it's just speeds there. I think they're looking at there's a couple examples of really kind of smaller roundabouts that Spokane's installed. So I think they're looking at potentially, submitting the grant for a smaller roundabout at that intersection to try to prevent that.
Yeah, for those if you don't use A Street a lot, it's quite, with the hills, it's a little bit of an issue. I seem to drive A Street all the time because I have a unit on in that area, and if you're not careful, people come ripping over the hill, and they're enjoying themselves, and then all of a sudden there's something going on. You can't see the car ahead very well, and I think that happens because students get used to just walking across streets, presuming everybody's going to screech to a halt around campus, and then on A Street, people don't screech to a halt so much.
Yeah, 6th Street has a few of those too. I mean, because I run across that a lot, and so.
Yeah, right. We
Yeah.
have the same thing on
Yeah.
on 6th a little bit with
Yeah.
with those hills. So.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks, Joel. Any announcements? Items in closing? I just realized Dennis wasn't here tonight too, right? Did you hear from it? Oh, okay, yeah. I knew there was somebody missing. Okay, well, I guess we'll adjourn. Thank you, everybody.
Hey, Wendy?
Yes.
Wendy, before you go,
Okay,
thanks to everybody for indulging.
Oh.
And Happy New Year to everybody, and congratulations.
Oh, yeah, congratulations to you. You're going to be running the next 2 meetings while I call in.
Oh, goodness. Okay.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, everybody.
Have a good night, Rob.